Did the Biden administration help to cover up Israel's assassination of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh? This week on UpFront, I'll be asking that question to Steve Gabavics, a retired U.S. colonel-turned-whistleblower who was sent by the U.S. State Department to investigate her killing. Steve Gabavics, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Absolutely appreciate it.
Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in 2022 while covering an Israeli raid on the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. Earlier this year, you spoke out anonymously and challenged the Biden administration's official findings. You said, quote, "The U.S. should have absolutely come forward and actually pressed the fact that an American citizen was killed intentionally by Israeli defense forces." Talk to me about your role on the ground in the official U.S. review of Abu Akleh's death, and also how you came to this conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was serving as the chief of staff for the United States Security Coordinator for Israel and Palestinian Authority at the time. I'm a career law enforcement officer with the United States Army. And what we did initially after Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, we tried to get the FBI to come on board to do the investigation formally. But when we talked to them, they came back to D.C., they indicated that they could not do so because they were not either invited in by the government of Israel and it was not deemed an act of terrorism. So they said they didn't have jurisdiction. At that point in time, the Ambassador Tom Nides, and my boss, Lieutenant General Fenzel, decided, okay, we need to look at this somehow. And because we had law enforcement expertise within our organization, I was tasked to lead the inquiry/investigation into killing Shireen Abu Akleh.
Your supervisor, the U.S. Security Coordinator of the Israel-Palestine Authority, as you mentioned, disagreed with you and your findings. The State Department then released their official stance, calling it an unintentional shooting by an Israeli soldier and saying that a, quote, definitive conclusion could not be reached due to the condition of the bullet. I've read that many times, and I'm still struggling to understand what that means.
Yeah, so the reality is, so the investigation that we did on the ground, literally from looking at all the details that existed, from the video evidence, the acoustic evidence, the people on the ground, the PA's investigation, information we had from the IDF, was clearly that it was an intentional shooting of Shireen Abu Akleh. Went back on the ground there myself, along with the team, several times, walked the ground, recreated the incident itself, and actually saw how clearly it was to be identified that it was somebody wearing a media vest, with a blue vest.
I was a blue, bright, a very clear, prominently positioned.
Very prominently. And I could see it at 190 meters away with my plain eyes, much less with an optic, which the sniper would have had within the IDF unit there, without question. So we looked at everything from triangulation, from the shot groups to the angles of the bullets and everything else like that, and it became abundantly clear that it was actually aimed shots, without question, at Shireen Abu Akleh. Whether or not they thought it was her, I don't know. They knew she was there, but they definitely knew it was media. So I presented that back to the U.S. government. I presented it to Tom Nides, the Ambassador Nides, initially, and I said, there is absolutely enough evidence here right now from what I have. I could put together a legal case that we could take it to the court of law in the United States. And without even talking to the person who shot her to determine whether or not there was intent or not, there's enough for manslaughter, without question, from the facts and details that are on the ground. Initially, Tom Nides was like, absolutely, we need to look at this. We need to find out what actually the details are and take action against it. And then things changed with the administration. And my boss, Lieutenant General Fenzel, he had stuck with his perspective from the day, May 11th, when he met with Major General Fuchs, who was the Israeli IDF Central Command commander, who stated it was, if it was us, it was a tragic accident, nothing intentional, and that's what he stayed with the entire time, in spite of the evidence that I was able to present to him that it was an intentional shooting of Shireen Abu Akleh.
Why? Why do you think those findings get dismissed? How do you go from, sure, we'll look into this, and if you're right, we'll pursue it? How do you get from that to inconclusive reports and damaged bullets?
Yeah, so I think what came down is they did not want to agitate the Israelis and say that it was an intentional killing of an American citizen because the evidence was there, but they did not want to push that idea that it was, intentional. Lieutenant General Fenzel was very adamant about the fact that if he were to come out and say that it was an intentional killing of an American citizen, that he would be considered persona non grata. and would not be able to stay and do his job as the security coordinator and coordinate with the Israelis going forward. So that was his prerogative on that one, that if I do this, I can't do my job.
And that was explicitly articulated.
Explicitly articulated. He literally told me, if I do this, if I say that it's intentional, I'll be P&G'd and I will not be able to do my job.
Wow. Wow. So ultimately they end up with this excuse, the damaged bullet excuse.
Right.
What does that even mean?
So the bullet was irrelevant, honestly, in my mind, because there was no chain of custody for anything for the weapon that was actually evaluated for doing the ballistics test. More than anything else, what it gave is an escape for the Israelis to say, oh, you can't prove that it was us that did it, so it could very easily be a Palestinian that did this. So that was why they agreed to give us a weapon to shoot, which we can never verify was actually the weapon that was shot out of the vehicle at Shireen Abu Akleh, because it gave an escape to say, oh, the bullet doesn't match, or we can't say that it matches, so therefore we will excuse them and say it was a tragic accident, it was tragic circumstances, and she was accidentally killed.
You said that the government's response to Abu Akleh's killing has weighed heavily on your conscience for years. Do you believe that the Biden administration lied outright and deliberately, purely to avoid damaging the relationship with Israel, or do you think there was another play here as well?
So I think it was largely at the point in time with the change of almost, so you had the change of the administration in Israel at the point in time, the Biden administration trying to maintain new relationships with the Netanyahu government, again, coming in. I think that they pushed it under the rug. Obviously, you had the Naftali Bennett, government, and then the transition to Netanyahu. They did not want to create any problems at all, and so I wholeheartedly believe that it was absolutely intentional to not pursue, not press the FBI to go in there and do a formal investigation, not make Israel held accountable for it, not hold them to the standards of the Leahy Act or anything else like that for acts of, violence and things against, international law for killing civilians.
Israeli officials initially claimed that Abu Akleh was shot by a Palestinian gunman. There's been reporting around Israel's tactic of, shifting blame onto Palestinian fighters to cover up this practice at this point of targeting journalists. At the time, did you have a sense that Israel's response to Abu Akleh's killing fit into a broader and long-standing kind of propaganda strategy?
Oh, absolutely. Because we saw that, honestly, since the early 2000s in the Second Intifada, where you have numerous journalists that have been killed, but it always comes back from the Israeli perspective that it was accidental, no one ever targeted any, and journalists, and you see it in Gaza, obviously, hundreds of journalists have been killed. They will never recognize the fact that they've actually intentionally killed journalists, and even if they're not intentionally killing them, they're not doing any of the standards required by international law to protect them as protected individuals in the environment of military operation.
And they're taking it a step further, though, and they're not just saying, we didn't do it or we don't know. They're saying they did it.
Exactly. Yep. And that tends to be the normal case. Anytime there's a civilian killed, they say, well, it was, the Palestinians were there, we were returning fire, they were shooting at us, and it was an accidental shooting of at an innocent civilian. But you see many examples where the IDF goes into different places, and literally there was a girl that was 8 years old going up and get her cat on the top of the roof that was shot 3 times in the head. Yeah. Those things are not by accident. Those are intentional targeting. You do not do headshots, and that's what the IDF does on a regular basis, is headshots. And that's the way they take things out. So when they said that it was the Palestinian gunman, they thought, because we were there doing an operation, there was some gunfire back 45 minutes before the incident with Shireen Abu Akleh, that we can say was a gunman there. Although everything disproved that very, very quickly. And obviously, they literally released a video that said this is where the Palestinian gunman was, and it was nowhere near where Shireen Abu Akleh was.
Right.
And no bullet could have ever hit her from that direction.
Biden initially vowed a full and transparent accounting of Abu Akleh's death. What came of that?
So obviously the Biden administration never did anything after they realized that it was not a Palestinian gunman. They literally changed every dynamic of how they were dealing with the situation. Biden had said, we'll hold them accountable, we'll find them, everything else like that. After it was determined that it was not a Palestinian gunman, the administration did nothing. They talked to no one. They did not pressure the government of Israel at all to do anything for an investigation whatsoever. So I think, what it came down to is they would rather wash it under the rug and not have to deal with the fact that, an American was killed and let it just flow away. Because we've had that before. I mean, literally that January, we had another American citizen who was killed as well by the IDF, and they let that float away, without any accountability.
Now, Abu Akleh died in 2022, but since then, we've seen more than 2 years of genocide in Gaza. That includes more than 69,000 Palestinians killed, as well as more than 200 journalists killed during that time. Did everything that has unfolded in Gaza since October 7th play any role in your decision to come forward?
So I think the big thing comes down to accountability, period. So it did. I mean, the same thing, I'm a military veteran, so we have ourselves had many mistakes that we've made, in Iraq, Afghanistan, everywhere else like that. And we've generally been pretty good, not perfect by any stretch, of coming out and actually admitting when we did things wrong and holding people accountable for actions that are against, the laws of war and everything else like that. So when you see different actions that are done and you see the fact that you have civilians being killed, you see indiscriminate aspects of how they utilize their artillery, their rockets, and everything else like that, yeah, it absolutely did. Because there always are going to be civilian casualties. It's just sort of a reality of war, unfortunately. But the fact that you see the IDF literally taking out an entire apartment complex to go after one person and they consider that acceptable by collateral damage standpoints, that's not acceptable by any standards.
Israel's genocide in Gaza has also brought more international attention to the escalating settler violence and the increased illegal settlements in the West Bank, which is also happening during this time. But it seems like all this attention isn't necessarily translating to any kind of slowing of settlement expansion or any kind of accountability under international humanitarian law. Why?
That's a good question. We worked very, very heavily when I was over in Israel on trying to get the settler violence issue propagated across, the U.S. government to take action against them. And we were relatively not successful. We had a couple people that were given sanctions by the Biden administration, but there were many, many more that were on the desk of the administration and on Anthony Blinken's desk that were never signed to do anything for holding people accountable. And it's just perpetuated and gotten worse and worse and worse. And we've not held anybody accountable for that in a way that makes a change or difference.
Part of the outrage in the United States over Abu Akleh's death stemmed from the belief that her American citizenship should have protected her and ensured that she received justice. But Israel regularly kills Palestinian journalists, and they do it with impunity, and they do it without international scrutiny. Do you believe there are selective calls for accountability when it comes to Palestinians?
Without question. Without absolute question. If Shireen Abu Akleh had not been an American citizen, the United States government would not have even done a thing. They would not have even looked at it. When I was over for 3 years, we had not, and the role with USSC was not to do investigations. That was not the basis. But if an American citizen was killed, a journalist was killed, we looked at American stuff. Any other Palestinian killed, no one cared. And I think that's one of the major factors to it. Unless it's an American citizen, it does not get the attention. It does not get the focus. And that's part of the problem because it perpetuates the bigger picture of the fact that there's no accountability for taking the lives of a Palestinian because we don't recognize that as something important.
Rachel Corrie was killed by an Israeli army bulldozer in 2003, and there was never any accountability or any legal consequences for her death. In 2022, the same year Abu Akleh was killed, U.S. citizen Omar Assad died after being detained by Israeli troops in the West Bank. And again, no accountability. Just this year, 14-year-old Palestinian-American Amr Rabi was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers. Once more, no accountability. In fact, no Israeli killings of Americans have led to any criminal charges or U.S. actions against Israel. Given this pattern, why should we have faith in the U.S.'s ability or willingness to hold Israel accountable for the death of Shireen Abu Akleh?
So that's been one of the disturbing things for my entire time is that we've not held anybody accountable over time. And there's no excuse for that. I mean, we hold ourselves accountable for things. We try to hold other nations accountable for things. The fact that we have Israel as our ally and that we use them as our proxy against Iran is not an excuse. But that's what has been the case, generally speaking. I think that where we stand right now with Shireen Abu Akleh, and everything else. What I hope right now is the fact that we have the Gaza situation, we have the efforts to get after a peace of some type there in Gaza, and the United States is asserting itself in many ways with Israel, that we may at this point in time actually say, hey, you can't do this stuff. You cannot kill Americans. You can't kill anybody, indiscriminately. But if you do this to an American, you're going to be held accountable, and we're going to hold you accountable for that. So
what does accountability look like in this context? I mean, is it legal? Is it diplomatic? I mean, are we talking about not sending money? Are we talking about finally affirming the ICC's findings when things happen?
So in my mind, the easy way for America to hold Israel accountable, or anybody accountable, is actually the purse strings. It very much is. Because that's something we absolutely control. And we give billions of dollars every year to Israel. So if we hold them accountable in that way, and we limit or restrict funds from going to different organizations that are involved with war crimes, or we, prevent them from getting training with us or giving them aircraft or something else like that, and same thing with any nation that's doing the same things, that's the easiest way for us to be accountable, and hold them accountable for that.
You served as a military policeman for 30 years. That included Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay. Were there other cases or other moments of your career when you felt that the U.S. government was acting in ways that conflicted with truth and justice? Were there other moments that forced you to similarly question U.S. authority?
Generally speaking, no. Not in the same context of what we had in Israel, Shireen Abu Akleh. There were certainly incidents that arise particularly in Iraq early on, where we had so many different incidents where we were shooting first and then dealing with situations after the fact. But eventually, America absolutely, held itself accountable for that. Those were troubling times at the point in time.
Do you feel the United States held itself sufficiently accountable for what's happened in Iraq?
It took a long time. It took too long. But we eventually changed the way that we did things there, and we never held individuals accountable for things.
Yeah.
There were a few that were, but very limited. But eventually, we at least changed the mandate for how things are done, like Israel should do with their rules of engagement.
Yeah.
But we eventually did. But it took too long. So there were definitely gaps in things, and I think that tends to be pretty evident in every warfare that you have many things that occur in the early stages that are wrong, and you learn from them. The question is, do you actually learn from them and do something about that?
Yeah. I was going to say, because hundreds of thousands of civilians died in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Very rarely have we seen any accountability for those deaths. And I understand, even stipulating that civilians are always going to die when there's a war, I think it's generally accepted that many of those deaths were unnecessary. So it's sort of challenging for many people to accept that enough was done. And so again, the question for me becomes, what would more look like?
Yeah, so I think, when I look at it over time, particularly when Iraq, and particularly Iraq, I look at that because early on there was no concern for collateral damage, and we would take out a building, and whoever happened to be in the way, so be it. There should be a lot more accountability for that. There needs to be a look at what really transpired, what the decision factors were behind it. Unfortunately, I think the reality is with any military operation globally, and we can see historically, unless it's something that actually literally stands out as one person made a decision that was going to be an absolute violation of the law of war, we try to change it, but we do not hold people accountable for that. And that just has historically been the way it is.
What do you say to people who say the U.S. doesn't have the ability to hold Israel accountable or anybody else accountable because of its own actions around the world, that they don't have the moral authority and maybe not even the legal authority to make those kinds of moves?
Well, we have no legal authority to do anything of another country, obviously, but we can absolutely hold them accountable in the way what we give them in terms of funding and everything else like that. I honestly think that the United States, we have many problems. Obviously, I love the military. I love what we do. I love the way that we've been able to improve and do and learn from our mistakes. So I do think that we have, some actual clout and ability to say, hey, we've made the same mistakes and we fixed it. We're far from perfect, but we did things to fix it. and you're not. So we're not sitting on this, white, tower on top of the hill saying that we're perfect.
But
we take
it's not
efforts.
just not being perfect. I mean, for example, the Hadithim massacre in 2005, when a group of U.S. Marines killed 24 Iraqi civilians, including children, resulted in one of the longest U.S. war crimes investigations. And yet, no one faced any jail time.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to the fact that, sort of like the Israelis did, honestly, with Shireen Abu Akleh, that it was the fog of war, stuff happens.
Yeah.
And I disagree with that. I mean, there absolutely should have been people held accountable for that. A massacre, just go back to like My Lai massacre and stuff like that in Vietnam. We held people accountable for it, but it took a long time to happen. And My Lai was not the only one that happened, obviously.
Right. But that's just the thing. We seem to be really good at holding other people accountable when we want to. Not so much when the mirror is facing us.
Not at the same level and degree, no. I think we tend to change policies. We tend to change ways so it doesn't happen again. But we're not very good at literally holding individuals or units or people accountable for different actions that happen.
You were a commander at Guantanamo Bay Prison, a place synonymous with torture and human rights abuses, where detainees were held for years without trial or even sometimes even without a charge. Human rights groups have called it a stain on U.S. history and a legal black hole. Working in that environment, were you ever forced to confront any questions around ethics or legality?
So every day I was involved, with everything going on legally as well as with the treatment and care of the detainees on the ground. And, for my 2 years there, every bit of what I did was modify things to make it much more humane. It was all about that no matter what, whether they're guilty or not, everybody needs to be treated with dignity and humanity. So that's one of the things that I put in place for the 2 years I was there.
You worked at Guantanamo during an interesting time. It was kind of the transition period between Obama and Trump. Obama wanted to close Guantanamo. Trump vowed to keep it open. What do you think should ultimately happen?
Well, I think that, there's certainly people that need to be held accountable for different things, but they need to have the trial. They need to get it done. I think that my biggest challenge with Guantanamo is the fact that we have let the legal system get in the way of ever holding anybody actually accountable and doing what we're supposed to do by our justice system, a fair and speedy trial. And we've had, for example, the 9/11-5 that have been on trial since 2009, and we're 16 years later, and we're not done with that. I think that Guantanamo is an easy way to do things because they're, law of war detainees. They're not prisoners, so that it gives us the escape of not having to bring them to the U.S. prison system. But I think if we actually bring them up on charges, if we have charges on them, then we can actually charge them and hold them in the States. And if they're found guilty, they're found guilty, and they'll serve their time. If they're not found guilty, well, then they're not found guilty.
So you're suggesting closing Guantanamo and moving them to prisons where they can get more speedily through the...
I think so, yes. Yeah. I don't think we need to maintain Guantanamo if we actually utilize the judicial system the way we need to. Keeping them there in limbo, ultimately, is not the right answer.
Around a dozen government and military officials have resigned in protest over U.S. policy toward Israel and Gaza. You initially spoke out anonymously and then felt able to come out publicly after you retired in January. Would you encourage those who still work in government to step up and publicly voice their concerns and their criticism?
Yeah, I would. And I would say, come out and, save your opinion on it. And I'm not anti-Israel. I'm not,
When you say come out, you mean come out in public or leave the job?
No, come on. Well, come out in public or leave the job. If it's something that you do not believe in, then leave the job. Mm-hmm. But do it both ways.
So if they're in the job, do you encourage them to step up and say, hey, I have something to say here about this injustice?
I do. And I highly recommend people do that. And I think the biggest thing that I would recommend for anybody that needs to come out is do not do it in a partisan way. I think that's the biggest thing that creates animosity no matter what it is. And I hate to say that, but politics plays in everything that is done, period. And I don't talk Republican, I don't talk Democrat. I literally talk about what I believe is the truth and the facts. And I think that's much more powerful than trying to play either side against each other, because that is what actually gets things done.
Steve Gabavics, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Absolutely. Thank you.